Well, of course, AI is only as good as the quality of the data that it's trained on, which means tech giants like Meta and Google with a sizable edge can crush smaller players. Our next guest says billions of dollars of data was bought and sold over the last 12 months and expects it to double this year. Now, how does AI turn our data into dollars in the marketplace? Well, to tell us more, Brad Schneider, Nomad Data CEO, is here. Thank you for joining us this morning. So, as Akiko was mentioning, when people think of AI and data, it seems this sort of amorphous blob here. So what do we need to know about the sort of data that these large language models are trained on and how it actually turns into dollars for some of these companies that want to use it?
Sure. I mean, one of the biggest first movers is just the media sites themselves, right? A lot of these AI engines are trained on enormous corpuses of text. And so, firms like Yahoo, for example, and many of the other premier media outlets are starting to license this data to train the largest models. And that's really going to drive the first wave of this. But the second wave is going to be these more specific models, these narrower models that people are putting into the hands of consumers, where they're there to perform one individual specific function. And that is going to expand the breadth of data necessary for training pretty dramatically.
And so obviously there's a fire hose of data that's out there, even more than ever thanks to large language models. So which companies or sectors are really leading the charge and really making the most of this, especially some of these larger companies that obviously have a lot more access to data?
I mean, it's an interesting question. Obviously, the large companies, the Microsofts, the OpenAIs, the Anthropics, they're driving sort of the beginning of this revolution. And so they're the most data hungry ones today. But really, the scale of those companies requires them to sell things to enormous numbers of people. So they're building the tools. If you think about the gold rush, for example, those selling the picks and shovels were the largest of companies and the ones that sort of stood the test of time. And that's what we're seeing with these large tech companies. But really, at least from my point of view, the innovation is going to happen with the people that are using those tools. So a lot of these companies that you have not heard of, it's going to really allow small companies to innovate and move a lot more quickly than a big company can for a variety of different reasons. Most of these companies selling the infrastructure, a Microsoft, for example, they can't be building a product that does $1 million a year in revenue. Their revenue scale is so enormous that they need to sell something to everybody. And so I think the real innovation is going to come from companies that you've heard less about, or maybe you haven't considered that AI could play a big role in.
So, Brad, the innovation may come from some of those companies we haven't heard about yet, but the reality is every company out there is trying to figure out how to integrate this technology into their product and services. I mean, what you just suggested in terms of the amount of data that's necessary seems to suggest a widening divide between the Googles of the world and then some of the smaller companies. I mean, you're right at the center of that with the data. Well, what are you seeing as some of these smaller companies try to play catch up?
So I think you're seeing a dichotomy. So on one side of the world, you've got the infrastructure companies, the people of massive scale, the Googles, the Microsofts, training these huge models, which will be used by everybody. But the smaller companies, they're focusing on where they can differentiate, which is finding unique data to solve a much narrower problem. And that's something that the larger companies are going to have a tough time going after. And so you're seeing the more specific pointed applications being built by these smaller companies, whereas the large companies, they just want to be the picks and shovels to power this innovation. And that is a very expensive game to play. So you're not going to see that many people at the top of that pyramid.
So, Brad, if you're a company and you're saying, look, I need the specific data because I want to launch a product or a service, and I really need to know if this is the demographic that will spend on it and things like that, what would be the option of looking at, say, using OpenAI versus investing in your own sort of proprietary LLM model in terms of the costs and being able to target your specific demographics?
It's obviously easier to start out using a third-party service like an OpenAI because it means I can bring a product to market very quickly. GPT-4 is an extremely powerful model. And so I can build that into my product. I can test out, is there consumer reception for this? Do companies want to buy this product? You want to figure that out before you go ahead and spend, let's say, $50 million to build a generalized LLM. And the other complexity is getting that training data is very hard. And so I run one of the largest data marketplaces on earth, and we get people asking for very bespoke pieces of data to train models. And it's almost like a detective hunt sometimes to find it. For example, let's say you want to train a legal model on legal documents. You need to somehow get thousands of companies' real legal documents. So these data sets can be extremely hard to acquire. And so a lot of the competitive advantage that will be built over time is by securing the access to these streams of data. At the end of the day, the way the LLMs work is no longer rocket science. People understand how to build these things. It's the data itself which creates the differentiation. The cost of compute will continue to go down over time, but the access to the data you need to build these models, many people are trying to lock up. And that's been a strategy around data, even before LLMs, is if you have access to something of value, you try to lock it up and make sure that others can't get to it.